I think we'll make a start. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this talk by Amanda Shubert, which is co-sponsored by the Center for Global Jewish Studies, the English and Comparative Literary Studies Department, and the Global History and Culture Center. And now I'm going to hand over to Guido, who's the director at the moment of the Global History and Culture Center.
Thank you. So I just want to welcome you, Amanda, on behalf of our center, and also say that I think this is the first formal event that we are co-hosting with the new Center for Global Jewish Studies. Although, as Anna mentioned, we did co-host a speaker 2 years ago. It has been 2 years already. I was going to say last year, and this would be the second time. Yeah, so welcome to the talk. I think Ross will introduce you properly. So welcome on my part. Thank you.
So I'm just going to do a short introduction. So Amanda teaches in the English program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's a 2023-2024 fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, which is kind of wonderful fellowship scheme. Her essays have been published in Victorian Studies, Victorian Literature and Culture, 19th Century Gender Studies, and Film Criticism, among other journals. Her first book, Seeing Things, Virtual Aesthetics in Victorian Culture, is coming out with Cornell University Press next year. So we look forward to reading that. So thanks very much for coming, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. Is everybody seeing my slides? Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much to Ross Forman and Anna Haikova and the Center for Jewish Studies for inviting me to speak to you today. I am new to the field of Jewish studies, and in fact, you're the first Jewish studies audience that I've had the chance to speak to about my work. So my background is in Victorian literature, and right now I'm completing my first book on Victorian media aesthetics. What I'm sharing with you today is new work from a book project on Arab Jews, sometimes called Oriental Jews, or more commonly now Mizrahim, in British India in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I'll use the terms Arab Jew in this talk, or Mizrahi, and Mizrahi, for those who don't know, is Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. I'm imagining this book as a cultural history that takes up the visual, material, and literary archives of Arab Jews in India to ask how they negotiated their cultural, political, social, and economic position in an imperial scene characterized by emergent nationalisms, Arab, Jewish, and Indian. I'd like to use my time with you today in two ways. First, I want to walk you through sort of the motivation for the project and some of the big picture questions that I'm trying to address. And then I'll share an early piece of the research, which is an analysis of the illuminated Ketubah in Calcutta between about 1850 and 1930. And I hope this will set us up for a robust conversation, because I'm really eager and excited to hear your thoughts and ideas as I develop the project. So why Arab Jews in British India? What am I trying to discover here? The answer is personal. I am the daughter and granddaughter of Indian Jews of Arab descent. And what you're seeing on the left is my grandmother holding my mom as a very small person. And on the right, my mother holding me as a very small person. My mother was born into a community of primarily Iraqi and Syrian Jews that settled in Calcutta in the early 1800s and called itself the Baghdadi Jews of India. And in this context, Baghdadi Jews is a sort of misleading term because it doesn't mean just Jews from Baghdad or just Jews from Iraq, but Jews from the Middle East more broadly who followed Baghdadi custom and religious law. With her parents, my mother immigrated to Canada in 1953, fleeing post-partition violence in Bengal and what many Jews experienced as the political uncertainty of a newly independent India. When I was growing up, my grandmother loved to tell stories about Jewish Calcutta and worked tirelessly to preserve its history. Still, I could never quite figure out what I was, sort of culturally and ethnically. I knew that I looked different than the Ashkenazi Jews that I grew up around, and that there was certainly something different about my Indian grandparents from my father's Ashkenazi side of the family. But the exact nature of that difference was felt impossible to pinpoint. When questioned, my grandmother would say that we were not Indian, we were Jewish, that we were not Baghdadi, we were Baghdadi Jews, which was a different thing. My grandfather would say that we were Sephardic among the Jews expelled from Spain in the 1490s, a story that, even if it's true for certain strains of the family tree, certain branches of the family tree, sort of casually erased 400 years of life in the Middle East. They spoke about Jewish Calcutta as if it were a lost world, in no way commensurate with the Kolkata of today, unrecoverable. Our Baghdadiness was similarly impossible, seemingly impossible to recuperate to the political and cultural formations of the present. And maybe a way of thinking about that is to say that I'm 35 years old. I lived through 2 Iraq wars, one beginning when I was a teenager, and I never, while I was living through that, made a connection to those world historical events and my identity as Baghdadi and as having Iraqi ancestors. So I grew up sort of feeling as if my cultural identity existed in discourse alone. Oh, excuse me. Over the course of the last 4 years of research into my family history, I've come to understand this identity confusion, this sense of being culturally and ethnically abstracted in some way or unmoored, as a peculiar byproduct of modern colonial history. Because what I did not know about myself, what I was unable to know in spite of, in fact, overwhelming evidence, is something simultaneously very simple and deeply complicated. I am an Arab Jew. And like on one hand, of course I am. I am a Jew whose family comes from the Middle Eastern diaspora in South Asia. Yet for years, this simple idea was unthinkable to me. And it is this experience of the unthinkableness of my Arab Jewish identity that my work seeks to address. There are complex historical and political reasons why it was so hard to conceptualize my identity in such concrete and material terms. To be an Arab Jew in our historical moment is to be an oxymoron, to embody an identity that the colonial nationalisms of the 19th and 20th century made unthinkable. And of course, I'm thinking here of the kind of Jewish versus Arab, West versus East, civilization versus savagery framework, kind of colonial logic that we see playing out with deadly force right now in Gaza and in the West Bank, as well as in many ways on our campuses here in the US. And I want to say that just this morning while preparing this talk, I watched footage of my Muslim and Palestinian colleagues being forcibly arrested on my campus for a very peaceful and beautiful protest for divestment for Israel. So my heart is with them right now. As Ella Shohat, the Iraqi Jewish cultural historian, wrote 30 years ago, Arab Jews are treated as, quote, existentially nauseating or charmingly exotic. I love that phrase. Existentially nauseating or charmingly exotic. We are made abject by historical political formations that either reject the concept of our existence, existentially nauseating, or that integrate the fact of Arab Jewishness as antiquarian, out of time, the quaint residue of a pre-modern world, charmingly exotic. Or, as a colleague put it to me after I delivered a paper on my Arab Jewish ancestry shortly after Hamas's October 7th attack in Israel, quote, you embody an impossible subject position. She looked me right in the eyes and she said, you embody an impossible subject position. And I said, thank you, because I felt seen. In this project, I am asking what cultural identity looked like for Arab Jews in India before we became impossible. I am also asking how the history of British colonialism in India helped to create those conditions of impossibility. I am writing the history of how I became unthinkable to myself. This is a version of what the political theorist Mahmoud Mamdani has called decolonizing the political, or the use of history to denaturalize the political identities and categories that structure present nationalisms. With Shohat, I think of Arab Jew not as a static identity, but as a kind of critical framework that can unsettle nationalist and colonialist narratives of 19th and 20th century modernity. Shohat and other scholars of Mizrahi history working in this tradition have focused on the politically disruptive potential of Arab Jewish identity in relation to Zionism, linking Israel's discriminatory practices towards its Arab Jewish citizens to Israel's settler colonial project. And I'm thinking here of someone like Avi Shleim, the prominent Israeli new historian. I linked to a beautiful interview with him here, who has recently sort of turned to thinking about his Iraqi Jewish background through the lens of Shohat's work. And when I was preparing this talk and thinking about how to present the story of my not understanding my Arab Jewishness, I found this beautiful interview with him in which he told a very similar story, and I felt a little less crazy for also not getting it for a long time. So as a Victorianist who studies the Raj, I'm interested in a related but still quite different kind of story. The story of how Arab Jewishness was constructed and deconstructed in colonial Bombay and Calcutta. Unlike in Israel, where they were racialized as a Black underclass and subordinated to an Ashkenazi elite, in the cosmopolitan trade capitals of 19th and 20th century British India, Arab Jews were neither colonizers nor natives. They were an elite class of non-Europeans valued by the British for their mediating role in colonial trade, whose status under colonial law was flexible and constantly being renegotiated. And just because she's here today, I want to say that the best book on this subject is Yael Silliman's Jewish Portraits, Indian Frames, from which I've learned most of what I know about this community, the story. So this interstitial middleman position created a remarkable degree of political safety for Jews, but it also calls what my colleague Jeff Adelsberg calls a flight into whiteness, a process of identification with and complicity in the colonial white supremacist project during a period when Indian and British, Arab and Jew were increasingly being constructed as oppositional and mutually exclusive identities. Jeff is also here. Hi, Jeff. The history of Arab Jews in India is a history of how minority ethnic and religious communities navigated the experience of being Arab, Jewish, Indian, and British subjects during a period when it was increasingly difficult to be all four at once. The method that I'm using to write this cultural history is a kind of object-based analysis. So I'm building an archive of visual, material, and literary objects like photographs, cookbooks, amulets, legal decisions, newspapers. The archive keeps spiraling. It's not a given archive, it's in process and something I'm building. Documents that reveal how Arab Jews in India expressed and adapted a multivalent ethnic and cultural identity in relation to the changing requirements of empire, coloniality, and nationalism. I'd like to turn now to a piece of this archive, a collection of illuminated ketubahs or marriage contracts from the Arab Jewish community in Calcutta. So for those who don't know, a ketubah is a Jewish legal document, a marriage contract that specifies the bridegroom's responsibility to the bride. The Baghdadi Jews of India followed the Sephardi and Mizrahi custom of illuminating their ketubahs with, in this case, with watercolor and gold foil and sometimes silver foil. What I'm going to do is sort of walk you through the process that I went through in researching and analyzing these visual texts. I'm just going to tell it like a story because I think it's more interesting that way. And as I do so, I'm going to ask you to look closely at these objects and to sort of think with me about how the fascinating and intricate iconography of these visual texts embodies their owners' fluid and multivalent identities as Jews, Arabs, Indians, and British subjects. So let's begin where I began, with a ketubah from my family. The ketubah you're looking at here was made for my great-grandparents, Chaim Baruch Mingel and Rachel Cohen, upon their marriage in Calcutta in 1917. And to give you sort of an orientation to the kinds of text that you're seeing here, you'll see there are two sort of multi-foil arches at the top of the page. there that contain the blessings for the bride and groom. And those are written in a kind of square Mizrahi script, while the main body of the text is the legal agreement that's written in cursive with the date, the names of the couple, and the amount of the dowry and the bride price printed in larger square letters. The upper and lower textual portions that divide the blessings from the contract is modeled on the ketubahs of the Cochin Jews of India. And it employs a textual formula that has roots as far back as the medieval Islamic world. And I find it striking that even though the Baghdadi Jews of India defined themselves as such as Baghdadi Jews, because of their adherence to Baghdadi Jewish law and practice, they didn't actually replicate the textual formula that we see in Baghdadi ketubahs, but they adopted a new formula that drew on an existing Indian tradition. But I want to pivot from the text to the illumination, which is my focus today. Sorry, that was a preview of what's coming. When I first began thinking about this family, Ketubah, two things struck me as very interesting. The first is that a nearly identical 1895 Ketubah from Calcutta exists in the collection of the Jewish Museum in London. And it's not a great reproduction from the Jewish Museum, but I think you can see they're very, very similar. So at first I thought the similarities over more than 20 years could be explained by the use of a stencil. But when you look closely at the two documents, you can see there are small discrepancies in the size and placement of the figures, which tells us that they were both drawn and painted freehand. So these are handmade reproductions, completely handmade reproductions without the use of a stencil or a model. That tell us that standardization was one goal of ketubah ornamentation, but they also tell us that artists were free to innovate and to reimagine a prescribed formula in small ways. The second thing that struck me as interesting was the syncretic nature of the design, style, and iconography of the illumination. And let me walk you through sort of a few ways that I see that. So those multifoil arches that I pointed to earlier that contain the superscription are a characteristic element of Islamic architecture that's clearly being sort of visually quoted here. The densely patterned illuminated border with flowers, vegetation, and birds is a feature of Indian and Persian manuscript painting, reflecting the influence of Mughal traditions of illumination. And the comparison I've pulled here is a folio from a book of Sikh gurus from our collection here at UW-Madison, and notice the similar use of a decorative border with a repeating pattern of flowers and leaves. Notice especially the similarity in the use of lotus flowers in both examples. And just as a nice touch in the background of the 18th century folio, notice the multifoil arches. Meanwhile, the proud lions at the top of the composition seem to me like heraldic emblems of the British Empire. At the same time, as you might know, and as you might be thinking right now, well, all these elements that I've mentioned and some that I haven't that we see in the ketubah also resonate in Jewish culture and tradition. Peacocks are a favored motif in Jewish folk art around the globe, while lions are a symbol of Jewish nationhood and represent the tribe of Judah. The two windows, sure, they look like multifoil arches, but they also evoke the tablets of Moses. And the fish, these scaly red fish flaked with gold foil, which I haven't talked about yet, are Jewish symbols of fertility. So the more I looked at this ketubah design, the more it seemed to me that the stability of the format over time and these layered multivalent cultural meanings, Jewish, Islamic, Indian, British, were significant. The stability and the syncretism were significant and related to each other. It made me wonder if I could read these ceremonial visual texts as articulations of a diasporic cultural identity, their slippery iconography signifying across multiple cultural registers. Lions live in India, symbolize England, and stand for Jewish nationhood. The flowers could be lotuses, sure, but couldn't they also be roses, England's national symbol? There seemed to be a purposeful ambiguity of both and logic to the design. So that was my hypothesis. And to test it, I was going to need a bigger archive. So in my process of archive building, which is ongoing, I've now amassed reproductions of 36 illuminated ketubahs from Calcutta made between 1851 and 1929. And I find that my initial hunches were more promising than I could have dared to hope. Although the illuminations vary widely in quality, and they definitely show the imprint of individual hands and visions, they are remarkably stable in format, composition, iconography, and even color. And they all show this kind of syncretism that I've been pointing to. So what I'd like to do is just show you a handful of them so you can get a sense, just a general sense of what this archive looks like. And then in our conversation, you can tell me what you think. So this is my earliest, and I've just given you a handful from over the years. So notice any similarities? Just kidding. So we always see the lions mounted on either side of the medallion, the two fish, and the border printed with geometric and repeating patterns of flowers, plants, and birds with a prevailing color palette of lush green, bright blue, and bold red or pink. As the Ketubah illumination expert Shalom Sabar notes, this is, quote, a new independent decorative scheme, unquote, to which Baghdadi Jews adhered with fascinating regularity for at least 80 years. And there may have been ketubahs like this before 1851 and after 1929 that I just haven't seen yet. While the iconography is consistent, I am struck by the way the Calcutta ketubah's meaning seems to shift in remarkably fluid ways both within and across the various examples, each one configuring Islamic, Indian, and British expressions of Jewish culture in slightly different ways. It's almost like the Calcutta Jews developed an iconography that can code switch. So I want to explain this idea of code switching in more detail by focusing on one iconographic element, and that's the lions that we see in every example. And I'm going to do that by turning first to the two earliest examples in my archive, which are two quite similar, as you can see, ketubahs from 1851 and 1852. The beasts atop the composition are also similar, both majestic, even kingly, and painted with a tender amount of detail. Their faces are flecked with gold, suggestive of a mane, and their white chests are lined to create the sort of illusion of the texture of fur. Gold foil has been applied to the body and outlined in black, creating dramatic stripes. Now, earlier, I suggested that the lions in my family ketubah could be maybe Judean lions, maybe symbols of British Empire, maybe both. But nothing about these lions convinces me that they are British, or even that they are necessarily lions. In fact, we seem to be looking at regal striped tigers that are overwhelmingly coded as Indian. First, note the almond-shaped eyes and thickly drawn black eyebrows, characteristic features of Mughal manuscript painting. Second, note that these lion tigers have a third eye beaming out of their brow chakra, a clear reference to Hindu religion and visual culture. Thirdly, notice the compositional similarities between the tigers of the ketubah and imagery of the Hindu goddess Durga on her tiger mount. This seems like could be a possible visual reference for these ketubahs. The Hindu registers of this imagery is striking, considering the placement of these tigers on either side of a medallion that contains a Jewish charm, including a formulation of medieval Yemenite origin. This is a synthesis of Hindu and Jewish iconography and a blending of Indian Jewish and Arab Jewish traditions. Now, not all the figures atop Calcutta ketubahs look so obviously like they've sprung out of Hindu mythology, but they are frequently sort of humanized lion tigers. In some cases, clearly lions, in others, obviously tigers, in others still basically cats. In addition to the anthropomorphic eyebrows, these lion tigers that you see here sometimes have mustaches, beards, and lips. Well, we can think of this as an evolution of the Hindu-Jewish imagery that we saw earlier. The explicit gendering of these figures points, I think, to other possible meanings. So there are lots of animal pairings in the Calcutta Ketubahs, and most of them are coded as a kind of male and female couple representing the bridegroom and the bride. You can see the examples of the birds that sort of almost, their beaks are almost kissing. So in this context, it's significant to me that the lions are, I think, pretty deliberately depicted as both male. The beards echoing those traditionally worn by Baghdadi Jewish men in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And you're seeing here, for comparison, a portrait of Moses Dweck Cohen, the first president of the Calcutta Jewish community, who, based on my research, and this isn't definitive, may have been the person to establish the ketubah format that we're looking at for the Calcutta community. So if these lions kind of lack the gravitas and protective authority of the ones that we've seen earlier, they do remind me of wise old Jewish men guarding the community, sort of like rugged feline rabbis. In fact, the lions in this 1929 ketubah appear to be holding quill pens. Maybe they represent the scribe and the illuminator responsible for creating the ketubah, or maybe the two male witnesses who sign it. But either way, the lions seem to draw on Hindu traditions of visual representation to reflexively inscribe into the ketubah the Jewish patriarchs and community leaders responsible for upholding the traditions of the Calcutta Jewish community. All this is not to say that the lions don't also register as British. In one striking example from 1858, we seem to see a lion and a unicorn in place of two lions, in a clear reference to the royal emblem of Britain. The lion, of course, is England and the unicorn Scotland. Even then, note that the illuminator, and I know this isn't a great image, but if you look closely, note that the illuminator has innovated on the royal emblem to depict the lion as, I think, as a tiger, right? I see stripes. I don't know if you do. Cannily blending Indian and British imperial iconography in a way that seems to subvert any obvious expression of political allegiance. It's not obvious to me how I should interpret this. Moreover, when we return to the Judean British lions of my great-grandparents' ketubah, we can see that they too have subtle black notches along the body. Are these notches meant to express kind of a lush texture of the lion's fur? Like, this is just giving us a sense of texture. Or do these lions also have the stripes of a tiger? Like the lotus flowers that could also be roses, the lion's ambiguous tiger stripes condense multiple cultural tropes into a single figure. So where does this leave us? It seems to me that each ketubah individually is syncretic, drawing from Jewish, Islamic, Hindu, and British iconographic traditions and forms. But looked at together, the archive of ketubahs seems to perform a remarkable feat of what I'm calling iconographic code switching, with different illuminations differently configuring the cultural significance of visual forms. Because the overall design of the Calcutta ketubah is so strictly adhered to over such a long period of time, we can read them kind of as one corporate text with many small variations, a text simultaneously singular and multiple. In this context, the small variations become meaningful choices that accrue meaning precisely through their difference from other possible forms. At the same time, the meaningfulness of an iconographic element like the lion seems to me to come not only from its difference, but also from the cumulative experience of its many variations. So when you're looking at a tiger, it's a tiger that also sometimes is a lion or also sometimes is a unicorn. We're always, they sort of have a cumulative identity that encourages us to think about why it's one way and not another way that it could possibly be. I think of the lions of the ketubah as a protean form that can be Judean, Hindu, and British, lions and tigers at various points and sometimes all at once. So the vast majority of the Calcutta ketubahs that I've seen share this visual formula that I've shown you today. But of the 36 examples that I've looked at, there are 7 made between the period of 1915 and 1924 that break the formula and do something else. I'd like to say a few words about them by way of conclusion because I think that they only reinforce the argument about code switching and cultural fluidity that we've seen so far. There are sort of the exceptions that prove the rule. And because all 7 of these that I've seen are basically identical, I'm just going to show you one that we can look at together. So we can see right off the bat that this ketubah adheres to some of the visual and compositional elements that we've seen so far. The thin illuminated border is topped with a medallion flanked by 2 animals, one of which is a lion. There are 2 windows with benedictions, beneath which we have the rectangular compartment with 2 fish. However, the iconography has also clearly transformed. Rather than the Islamic, Hindu, British imagery that we're used to, what we see here is almost exclusively biblical iconography of Jewish nationhood in the Holy Land, with symbols that read clearly as Jewish across the global Jewish diaspora, right? You're probably looking at this and thinking, well, this is clearly a ketubah, whereas the imagery from the earlier examples maybe don't read as obviously as Jewish. Some examples, with a shout out to my mom for identifying most of these for me because she's a better Jew. Instead of 2 lions, we have a lion and a wolf, which represent the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The medallion is not a circle, as we've become accustomed to, but a Star of David. The windows of benedictory text are no longer multifoil arches. It feels like they've been sort of de-Islamicized, and now they look a lot more like the tablets of Moses. Here I can bring up a detail shot that might make it easier to read some of these. So there are 2 flags in the topmost corners on the left and right, each bearing 12 dots, which stand for the 12 tribes of Israel. The candelabra and the oil jugs are associated with the tabernacle, the grapes, perhaps the fruit of the biblical land of Israel. Aside from the compositional similarities to other Calcutta ketubahs and the telltale fish, there are no visual elements that tell us that this ketubah was made for Jews living in India or for Jews of Arab descent. Rather than emplacing Calcutta Jews in Calcutta, this ketubah emplaces them symbolically in Eretz Israel. So my theory, and I'm wrapping up here, is that this second ketubah design reflects the rise of Zionist politics, sentiment, and organizing in Indian Jewish communities in the 1910s and 1920s, and the dream that the Jewish nation could exist within a Jewish nation state. Instead of the flamboyant cultural hybridity and syncretism of the more dominant ketubah design represented by my great-grandparents' 1917 example, this ketubah seems to articulate Jewishness as an identity that can, or perhaps even should, be extricated from its diasporic context. The contrast between these 2 designs highlights even further the way my family ketubah expresses an Arab Jewish identity rooted in and interdependent with 19th and 20th century Calcutta, an identity that would effectively disappear over the course of the next 3 decades as families like mine left India for Israel, Britain, and British Commonwealth countries like Canada. Comparing the 2 ketubah design formats, what I've come to think of as the Zionist design and the Arab Indian design highlights what makes my great-grandparents' ketubah and others like it that I've seen so special. If the Zionist ketubah design essentializes a universal Jewishness through biblical motifs, my family ketubah articulates Jewishness as diasporic and syncretic through a multivalent Arab, Indian, and British imperial vernacular. At the beginning of this talk, I asked what Arab Jewish identity looked like before it became unthinkable and impossible. I think it may have looked something like this. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Absolutely fascinating talk. So I'm going to moderate the Q&A part. maybe I can start by asking a question just to get us rolling, a kind of Victorianist question.